much use or much of the seventh-day Sabbath. Sometime after the disappointment of October 22, 1844, in that little Washington, New Hampshire church, a large farmer who weighed 260, 270 pounds or more stands up, and he announces that from henceforth, he and his family are all going to keep the Sabbath. So now they have a convert, Frederick Wheeler, the preacher, and of course there's Rachel and Delight, who are not, I guess, technically members, but attend there. And here stands up this man, William Farnsworth. Now, in 1844, William Farnsworth, his speech that me and my family henceforth are going to all be Sabbath keepers, it was not quite the impact that if he'd given it a few years later, because eventually he fathers 22 children. So if later he had said, well, me and my family, that would have been a good percentage of the church would have been represented when Dad spoke. Anyway, his younger brother, Cyrus Farnsworth, stands up, says he's going to keep the Sabbath. A couple others say, well, we're going to keep the Sabbath. The Farnsworth brothers' parents, Daniel and Patty Farnsworth, they stand up. They're going to keep the Sabbath. And so you have a little nucleus of Sabbath keepers there in Washington, New Hampshire. All right, so hang on to that one, Washington, New Hampshire nucleus, because we got to paint a picture. We're going to go over now to Joseph Bates. Now, we're going to have to give you a little background of Joseph Bates and then talk about how he got the Sabbath and try to bring all this together with Washington, New Hampshire and Bates. You see, some of these threads are kind of loose for a little while, and then you have to bring them all together. So let's talk a little bit about Joseph Bates. He was by far, in my opinion, the most colorful of our early pioneers, the founders of our church. You know what his profession was most of his life until he became a preacher? Sea captain, right? All right, so he was born in 1792 in Rochester, Massachusetts. When he was a year old, 1793 that would be, his father moved the family into Fairhaven, Massachusetts. Fairhaven at that point was still part of New Bedford. It would be a few years later before the two split. So now you have New Bedford on the west side of the Acushnet River, and you have Fairhaven on the east side of the Acushnet River. But when Bates is growing up, it's all New Bedford at this point, but the Fairhaven side of New Bedford. Bates, as a young man, wants to go to sea. Oh, by the way, just put in a commercial again for Adventist Heritage Ministry. If you're ever in Fairhaven, New Bedford area, make certain you don't miss going to see the Bates home. We just bought the Bates home, the boyhood home. It's the oldest house still standing in Fairhaven. It was built in 1742, so it goes back there a little ways. And so it was already 50 years old when in 1793 the family moves there. So it's 50 years old. It's an old house when they arrived. And it's still an old house, by the way, and needs a lot of work. If any of you have, crafts or skills that you'd like to help or money you'd like, well, feel free, but that's not what this purpose is all about either. However, since you said they're going to be telecasting these in anybody, should I put in also you can mail your donut? No. Anyway, here he's growing up, and his father was a partner in a school, and the school belongs to the Historical Society, and we assume, it's just about 3 blocks or so from where Bates was living, we assume that the school is where Joseph Bates attended. We can't prove it because the records are not there anymore. They've long since been lost or burned or something like happens in a lot of old towns. But we do know that the father was part owner and part founder of the school in 1798. So we assume that's where Joseph went to school. He had a big passion as a boy. He wants to go off to sea. His father, that's the last thing he wants, is his son to go off to sea. But Joseph is absolutely persuaded. That's what he's got to do. He wants to go to sea. So finally, Joseph's parents give in to the boy, and they think, well, if we could arrange with one of our friends who's a sea captain to take him on one voyage, he'll get so seasick, that'll be the end of his interest, and he'll finally get his thinking straightened around. And so, not quite 15 years of age, you can picture this kid climbing aboard. He's a cabin boy, and he is ecstatic. And guess what? I don't know if he got seasick, but he certainly didn't lose his interest in the sea. So for the next umpteen years, he's going to sea. Well, his first voyage, he goes to England, or goes to Europe, and on that voyage, he hears a story. Now, you want to measure this guy's sense of humor. I brought out a little bit about Miller's. On that voyage, he hears a story from a passenger. Now, this story that I'm going to read to you did not happen to William Miller. It happened to this other gentleman. But this teenage boy, about 15 years of age by this time, hears this man tell a story. And he must have retold and retold, Bates that is, must have told and retold that story. Because many years later, when they asked him to write his autobiography as a series of articles to go in our old youth paper called the Youth Instructor, why, Joseph Bates puts his story in. And then later, he prints it. I mean, they print those articles all up in a book, the autobiography of Joseph Bates. And there's the story. So, if you, when you hear this story, if you've never heard this one before that was told on that voyage, if when you hear this story you wonder about it, remember, the pioneers made this available for young people to read, maybe even on a Sabbath afternoon. Okay, here's Bates' story. I'm quoting now from his autobiography. Among our passengers to New York was a Mr. Lloyd, chief mate of a Philadelphia ship that was detained in London. He, in a very serious manner, related a very singular incident that occurred some few years previous while he was a sailor from Philadelphia. He said that he'd never dared to tell his mother or sisters of it. I will try, that's Bates now saying, I will try to relate it in his own words. Said he, quotation marks. Now, Bates is going to now try to remember. Remember, this is 50 years later. And if you've told a story and retold a story for 50 years, it may be embellished slightly. I will not promise it was not. But it's a good story, with embellishments or without. It's a good story, as you will see. Said he, I was lodging away from my home one night. This is now this Mr. Lloyd is talking. I was lodging away from home one night in another part of the city when the house was beset by the police. For fear of being identified with those that were disturbing the peace, I fled from my bed into the street with nothing but my nightdress on. You've seen pictures of women's and men's long nightgowns? Okay, that's what he's got. And finally secreted myself in the marketplace while a friend that was with me went back to obtain my clothes. About midnight, a gang of men passing through the marketplace discovered me. And after a few inquiries of who I was, etc., they said, drive this fellow on before us. My pleading was in vain. They continued to keep me with them until we entered the cemetery about 2 miles out of the city. We here came to a large flat stone with an iron hook in it. They placed a stout rope in the hook, which they brought with them, with which they swayed the stone up. This was opening a family vault where a Jewish lady of distinction had been deposited that day. The jewelry upon her person was what they were after. Did you ever think Adventist history was boring? My, you didn't know how exciting it was. The exciting question now was, who among them would go down into the vault and get the jewels? Said one, here's the fellow. I begged and entreated them for the Lord's sake not to require me to commit such a dreadful deed. My entreaties were disregarded. They crowded me down into the vault, ordering me to go and strip off the jewels. I tried, and then returned to the open place and stated that her fingers were so swollen that I could not get her rings off. Now it's going to get interesting. But remember, you're not seeing anything. You're just hearing me read a few words up here. Okay? Just keep that in mind. Here's a knife, said one. Take it and cut her fingers off. I began to plead again, but they gave me to understand that there was no alternative. I must either do it or stay where I was. Almost dead with fear, I laid hold of her hands and cut her fingers off. And when I came to the open place, they bid me to hand them up. As soon as they got hold of them, they dashed down the slab and ran away. I felt overwhelmed at my hopeless condition, doomed to die a most horrible death, and fearing every moment that the mangled corpse would lay hold of me. I listened to the rumbling sound of these robbers until all was silent as death. The stone over me, I could not move. After a little, I heard a distant rumbling of the ground, which continued to increase until I heard strange voices over the vault. I soon learned that this was another gang, most likely unbeknown to the first, and they were placing their rope to swing up the same stone slab. I at once decided what to do to save myself. You remember how he's dressed in this dark cemetery. I at once decided what to do to save myself. As the slab came up, I leaped out of the vault in my white nightdress or shirt. Horror-stricken, they all fled back toward the city, running with such speed that it was difficult for me to keep up behind them. And yet I feared, If they should stop, I should be discovered and taken. Before reaching the city, I had drawn up some nearer to the two hinder ones, when one of them cried out to his companion, Patrick, Patrick, the old woman is close to our heels. Onward they raced through the market and fled away from me, for I stopped here to hide myself. After a while, my friend, having obtained my clothes, found me, and I returned home. Now, you've probably all seen a picture of Joseph Bates, and I know he looks somber. But behind those funny-looking little square glasses that he wore, I think if you could see really behind there, you'd have to see a twinkle in those eyes. How else could you tell a story like this for 50 years and then have the nerve to put it in the youth instructor? You know what they'd do to me if I did something like that? Anyway, colorful fellow, 5 feet 9 inches tall. As I mentioned, he goes off to sea. He comes back, goes to a number of different countries, both in Europe and in South America. Works his way up until eventually he becomes a captain of his own ship. But in the meantime, when the War of 1812, he was impressed into the British Navy. I need to tell you this about him. He was impressed into the British Navy, which did not set too well with him. He was quite independent in his thinking. His whole life he was independent. But anyway, he was impressed in, but he got stuck going down into the Mediterranean and in a battle or two, and they were trying to get him to fight one time, and he said no, because at this point he was, I think this was after the war had broken out in the War of 1812, and he'd heard about that, and the British officer in charge said, well, we're going to then lash you over there to that main mast, and you know who they're going to fire at first in this battle? And Bates said, well, I would remind you, I'm an American citizen, but if that's what you're going to do, that's what you're going to do. I mean, he was just a fearless guy. It's really amazing. Actually, on that first voyage, I back up a little bit, on that first voyage, he was clear up in the crow's nest, lost his footing, and crashed all the way down into the water. Now, that's bad enough, but there had been a big shark that had been swimming along the ship, and he falls in. And everybody is so excited about him falling in, they have forgotten all about the shark. And finally, after they get him pulled out of the water, they say, where was that shark? And just before Bates fell in, the shark had moved to the other side of the ship and didn't have a clue, even then for, I guess, a good part of a number of hours he'd been on this side of the ship. Talk about God working. But anyway, so Bates is this independent character. Well, he's a prisoner of war because he will not fight his countrymen, so he demands to be treated as a prisoner of war during the War of 1812. And he finds himself in a ship, a leaky ship, that was used to hold prisoners, American prisoners. And that was just, you know, it was anchored half a mile or so off the coast of England. And they had these American prisoners down in the hold of the ship. Well, the Americans didn't particularly, I guess I would describe it this way, they didn't particularly appreciate the housing facilities that were given to them by King George, provided by King George. And so they decided that the best thing they should do was escape. And if they could just drill a hole in the side of this wood-hull ship, then maybe some of them at night could swim to shore quietly in the middle of the night, not get detected, and eventually get away. So Bates was not the leader. He wasn't the ringleader, but he was in the group that was taking their time. Each night they would try to carve some more on this hole in the side of the ship. One of the problems, of course, making certain that you're above the waterline when you do a thing like this. But they were good seamen, so I'm sure they could figure out where that was. But anyway, so they are working away, and the first night, a couple of people, I forgot, 2 or 3, get away. Slip into the water in the middle of the night. They would have to do most of their carving, as I understand it from the way Bates described it. They're carving on that hole, you know, trying to cut the hole when the British were up having change of the guard. Because other than that, it was quiet. And you would hear whatever you're trying to saw through the side. But while they're up there stomping around, you know how the British like to do their stuff, while they're having to change the guard and calling out the new orders and all that kind of thing, well, then they could be carving away down there until the next change of the guard. So it took them a little while to get this hole dug. Well, anyway, the first night, they removed the planking some way, and 2 or 3 got away. And so then during roll call, what you do is there's kind of commotion. It's dark down there. So when they're doing roll call, why some of the first that were counted, they just kind of ran to the end and got recounted. And the soldiers didn't know that anybody, I mean, the guards didn't know anybody was gone. Now, that's not going to last too long, but that at least gets the first few. Well, the next night, there were 2 of the prisoners that had not been part of this carving a hole in the side of the ship group. And so they demanded, they were a bit inebriated. They apparently got more than their fair share of the ale ration that was given by the British to the prisoners. And so they were well inebriated, and they demanded that they be allowed to leave the ship first that night. Do you know how to swim? Oh, yes, we know how to swim. That's, you've got to be quiet because, you'll get caught. Oh, yes, 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 we understand. And all the instructions were given. Well, when they came to that time late in the night to remove the planking and let these two guys who were drunk down into the water, if they knew how to swim, they were in no condition to swim. They started splashing around and all that. Well, guess what? The guards forget all about all this, whatever they're doing up there and the change of the guard. They realize that there's a escape on. So they come down into there, and of course then they have to patch the side of the ship. The guards have to arrange for the ship's carpenters to come. And Bates and his friends, guess what they do? As soon as all the clanking is going on down here where they're patching the hole, Bates and his friends are back here at the other end of the ship, and they're now working on the next hole. I mean, this guy is an independent, let me tell you. He was quite a guy. Anyway, he eventually comes home in, was it 1815, I think, 1816. He marries, 1815, I guess it was. He marries a young girl there in his hometown by the name of Prudence Nye. Eventually they'll have 5 children, 2 boys and 3 girls. He keeps going to sea. He was gone about 2 years one time. And you get 1 or 2 letters from your husband while they're gone that long. I mean, it's amazing how they lived and survived back in those days. That was on a voyage down to Brazil and on around to the other side of South America. Anyway, Bates begins some interesting traits in his character. He realizes as he is traveling and watching people and interacting with people that alcoholic beverages didn't make you act any better and didn't seem to make you feel any better. So between 1821 and 1824, he eventually discarded the use of all alcoholic beverages. In 1824, when he left on a voyage, his wife, Prudence, he called her Prudy, put a Bible in his sea trunk when he was heading to Brazil. And he begins to read. And he's converted to Christianity. Also in 1824, he decided to quit using tobacco. On one of his trips home, 1827, he joined the church that his wife belonged to. The Fairhaven Christian Church is still standing, by the way. It's not a church anymore, but it's still standing there in Fairhaven. He, in 1827, 1828, his wife has been pestering him. He's been going to sea since he got married 10 years before. And she's been kind of pestering him a little bit about, how much longer you're going to keep going to sea? When you're going to settle down here at home and stay home and that kind of thing. And he told her that when he had a competence, which was in his mind something like $10,000, that would be enough money. He was convinced that would be enough money that he and Prudy could live the rest of their lives if they had $10,000. So, 1827, 28, he is now captain of a temperance ship. There were a number of temperance ships. His was not the only one that went out of various ports in New England. By temperance ship, I mean, in Bates's case especially, I mean there's absolutely no alcohol on board except for one little bottle that he had for medicinal purposes if somebody got a terribly upset stomach, and they had to come to the captain to get a nip of that. But other than that, there was no alcohol. Now he waited until the ship was about 7 or 8 miles out to sea before he called everybody together on deck and told them what the rules were going to be for this voyage. Sailors were not given to receiving some of these instructions too happily. But anyway, there was to be no drinking and there would be no alcohol on board. There was to be no swearing. Absolutely no swearing of any sort. You were not to call each other Joe and Dan and Tim and Tom. It's Mr. this and Mr. that. Also, on every Sunday, there would be church services on board, on deck, and they were all expected to attend. If they were in port on a Sunday, they did not have shore leave. They were expected to be on the ship for church services. That didn't go over too well either. But anyway, it was a pretty calm voyage from what Bates reports. And when he came back in 1828, he sold his ship to his younger brother, Franklin Bates, and Franklin Bates then took it out on another temperance voyage. And in 1828, Joseph settles down there in Fairhaven. His father has died just before he got home, just a few months before, and for whatever reason, he inherited the house. His mother also died just shortly after he got home, so then he and Prudy had the house, the same one that we just bought, the boyhood home. And he would then, in 1831, he would sell that house to his brother, Franklin, or at least give it to him. Some way he gave it to him. Probably it was part of, technically I think it was part of settling the estate, and he gave the house to his younger brother, and the other property of the father Joseph got, because Joseph had Prudy moved a short distance away. Now, during the following years, besides being a member of the church and helping to build a church there in Fairhaven, the one that's still standing that his wife was a member of, by the way, it's interesting that there were 4 men who put up the money to build that little church that's no longer a church but still standing, and one of them was Warren Delano, who was the great or great-great-grandfather of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So, I mean, you kind of tie some of this into American history. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, 1837, Bates discards the use of tea and coffee. 1839, in New Bedford across the river, he goes to hear a Millerite preacher, and all of a sudden, Bates's life has changed. He had been into various reform movements before that. He was certainly very anti-slavery, but he was into other reform movements, but now he was into the reform movement of all reform movements, because when Jesus comes, every problem will be set right. And so now he throws his life and his energies into the preaching of the soon return of Jesus. 1843, he discards the use of meat. He also discarded the use of butter and cheese and pies and cakes. Basically, I mean, this is long before any health message in the Adventist church. There's no Adventist church. It's because he found he felt better, he could think better when he didn't have his mind all clogged up with all this stuff. 1841, William Miller came to Fairhaven and preached in that church that Bates had helped build, and 33 persons, including the Bates, left and formed their own little Second Advent society. In February of 1844, Bates has built a house, and he sells his house. And he decides he's going to settle up all of his debts. He thinks the Lord's coming in the spring of 1844. He does not want to owe anybody any money. He's also going to take a preaching trip. He wants one last chance to do some more preaching, and he wants to go down into Maryland. Now, as a young boy, on one of his voyages, he had been shipwrecked off of Kent Island in Maryland. And he wants to go down there, and he wants to see if he can find the people who 20 or so years before had so befriended him, and tell them about Jesus coming back. There was a young blacksmith there in the village. His name was Heman Gurney. Heman Gurney wasn't yet married. He was about 25, 26, and he would pound, as he was pounding away at his anvil, he would be singing hymns. So he's known in Adventist history as one of the 3 or 4 singing blacksmiths. We had some others that sang hymns as they would be pounding away at their anvils. And so Bates goes to Gurney, who apparently had a very, very nice voice, and said to him, I want to go down into Maryland to preach. Will you come with me? No, sir. No, sir. Gurney is not going down into Maryland. Maryland, you know, is a border state pre-Civil War. That meant slavery in Maryland. And the slave owners in the South did not take kindly to the Millerites coming, because almost all, if not all, Millerites were also ardent abolitionists. They were all anti-slavery. Jesus was coming to free everybody, and we need to get started at it now. So these slave owners figured that the Millerites, when they came down, all they really want to do is they just want to agitate our slaves and get them all to run away to freedom. So Gurney says, I know how they treat people down there. There's no way I'm going to go. And Miller says to him, he knows a little bit about, Bates, I should say, having been a sea captain, he knows a little bit about psychology. And he says to Gurney, he says, I'll tell you what, just travel with me over to Philadelphia. Brother Miller, it's been announced, is going to have a series of meetings in Philadelphia. After we listen to Brother Miller, if you don't want to go with me, I'll go on down into Maryland by myself. And you can return home. But guess what? After Gurney had heard Miller, I don't think there was any way you could keep him home. And the two of them go together. It's during that trip down into Maryland that you find this interesting story about one night they're going to hold a meeting, and somebody comes rushing up all out of breath. And they say to Bates and Gurney, you know, there's a mob forming about half a mile over here, and they're going to come over, and they're talking about tarring and feathering you and running you out of town, riding you out of town on a rail. And Bates looked at the messenger right back in his eye, and he said, you go tell that group that if they'll put a saddle on that rail, I'd rather ride than walk any time. And they never showed up. How would you deal with that kind of courage, you know? Anyway, so Bates gives all of his money away. By the time you come to the disappointment of October 22, 1844, Bates has no money. He's given it all away. He told a young minister many years later, he told a young minister, J.O. Corliss, he said, you know, when that disappointment came, and Jesus didn't come in 1844, he said, I wish I could have died. He said, I I had been a reputable, known as a reputable, upstanding citizen of Fairhaven. And I wish the ground, after that disappointment, I wish the ground had just opened up and swallowed me. We really don't know. None of us today know what it was like to go through the great disappointment. Well, Bates, shortly after the disappointment, in February or March of 1845, Bates was a subscriber to a paper that was printed up in Portland, Maine, called The Hope of Israel. And an article in The Hope of Israel, written by Thomas Preble, about the seventh-day Sabbath was printed in that paper, The Hope of Israel. Bates, down there in Fairhaven, reads the article, looks up the text, and decides that he will be a be a Sabbath keeper, because that's what the Bible teaches. And Bates was one who, when he becomes convinced of something, he moves out, and he does it. Prudy wasn't so sure. His wife just wasn't into this. Hadn't they, I don't know what went through the woman's mind, but hadn't they just been terribly disappointed and embarrassed at everything? Jesus didn't come. And now look at this, just a few months later. What crazy idea do you have now? I'm assuming. That's not come down to us. I'm assuming because she did not accept the Sabbath. So every Sunday, Bates was a good husband. So what would he do? He would take her in their little horse and buggy over to the church. And she would get out and go into the church. And guess what? Other people would be going into the church. And they knew good and well why Joseph Bates was no longer coming into the church. It was sort of like a little mini silent Bible study. Certainly a witnessing event. And then that's not all. When the service was over, guess who was there? Good gentleman and husband that he was. Sitting there waiting for his wife to come out after services. And here come the other people out of church also. And guess what they see? Captain Bates sitting out there, and they know good and well why Captain Bates isn't in church with them anymore, because he's accepted the seventh-day Sabbath. Well, he accepts the Sabbath. And now here comes where I'm going to try to link Washington, New Hampshire. Emphasis on try, because I can't prove this. Bates decides he wants to know more about the Sabbath. Now, if you have read an article by T.M. Preble, who would you necessarily go see if you want to know more about the Sabbath? T.M. Preble. Does that make sense? If you want to know and you've been convinced because of a Bible study written by a person, you'd want to go see the author. Who does he go see? Not T.M. Preble. He goes to see Frederick Wheeler. I'm guessing, this we cannot prove. No Adventist historian has been able to prove this, but this is my conjecture, that Bates probably wrote to T.M. Preble. Preble probably said, if you really want to know the facts, I got the Sabbath from my fellow, another pastor, Frederick Wheeler. We can't prove that. All we know is that rather than going to see Preble, in about April of 1845, just days or weeks after Bates has read the Sabbath, late April, early May 1845, Bates travels all the way up to Washington, up to Upper Hillsborough, actually, not Washington, New Hampshire. Arrives there about 10 o'clock at night, knocks on the door. A sleepy-eyed Frederick Wheeler comes to the door. And here is a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed Joseph Bates. He's just come in. How many miles he's walked, how he's got there, I don't have any idea. He could well have walked the whole distance. And that would not have intimidated Joseph Bates from things he did in the rest of his life. And so here's this guy, he's coming to the door, and, they're all asleep. You go to sleep with the chickens back in those days. So here he is. Bates is ready to go. Well, what's this all about out here? Well, I want to study the Sabbath. So you can picture Wheeler getting the candles out. They're starting to study there in 1845. The next day, they come over to Washington, New Hampshire, and they study the Sabbath in front of Cyrus Farnsworth's home. House is still standing. The trees they studied under blew down in 1988, but the house is still there. And then Bates goes back home. And he comes into New Bedford, and he walks across the bridge over the Acushnet River, and he bumps into a friend of his. Now, back in those days, if you bumped into a friend and you haven't seen somebody for a few days, guess what? They know you've been out of town or something, because everybody knew everybody's business. If you think we have it bad today, you can't imagine what it must have been back in those early days. Anyway, so this guy, who has a very interesting name, James Madison Monroe Hall. Can you imagine a mother naming her son for two presidents, Madison and Monroe? James Madison Monroe Hall. Anyway, James Madison Monroe Hall sees Captain Bates there on the bridge and calls out to him, "Captain Bates, what's the news?" Thinking, of course, that after he's been traveling, he's got some kind of news to say, because you couldn't go home and turn on the TV. There was no TV to get CNN or Fox News or whatever you get your news from. There's no way of doing that in those days, so if somebody's traveling, you want to get the latest. And Captain Bates responds, the news is that the seventh day is the Sabbath. And within about 2 weeks, James Madison Monroe Hall and his wife Abigail Hall both became Sabbath keepers. The first two converts that Joseph Bates had to the Sabbath. Prudy was not one of the first two. Number 3, she wasn't either. We know who number 3 was. After that, I don't know. But number 3 was Heman Gurney, the blacksmith. Prudy doesn't become a Sabbath keeper, by the way, until 1850. Anyway, now there's a little bit more of this Sabbath growing. Bates decides he wants to write his own tract on the Sabbath. And so he sits down and he begins to write a tract on the seventh-day Sabbath. Turns out being about 48 pages with the cover and all. I think it's 46 pages of text, but 48 pages. And he doesn't have any money. He's renting. We don't even know for sure. It's pretty well pinpointed where he probably, or some others did. I didn't work on this one, but pretty well pinpointed where he probably lived after the disappointment. But he didn't own any money. He owned no property, I should say, because he had no money. He'd given it all away. He just, as money would come in, little jobs, whatever he did, and people sending donations when they heard about his work once he got started doing that. So he had arranged with a printer on the other side of the river over in New Bedford, Benjamin Lindsay, down on Water Street, arranged with him that he could send in, Bates could send in payments for this tract that he wanted printed on the Sabbath. That was fine. Lindsay was agreeable to that. And so as money would come in, Bates would make his way across the bridge, over down to Water Street, and into the little print shop, and he would pay a little bit more on the bill. Now, one day over in Fairhaven, Heman Gurney, this is 1846, Heman Gurney, 2 years after, about almost 2.5 years after, he had gone with Bates down into Maryland to preach. Now, what I didn't tell you on that trip was, when Gurney decided that he wanted to go with Bates, he'd at least go to Philadelphia and then on down in there, he went to his employer who actually owned the blacksmith shop. And the employer said, if you are so crazy that you're going to go with that Bates guy to talk about this second coming stuff, I know I owe you some money, but I don't plan on paying you. So you just, if you walk away, you're walking away from the money. Well, now 2.5 years later, Gurney bumps into his former employer there in Fairhaven. The man says to him, you know, ever since you left to go down there into Maryland with Joseph Bates to preach a couple years ago, and I didn't pay you your back wages, I felt guilty about it. So you know what, I think I'm going to pay you. Now Gurney had completely given up any idea that he'd ever see that money. So guess what he decided to do? He's going to go over. He's going to find Benjamin Lindsay's print shop on Water Street, and he's going to pay some on that bill. So sure enough, Gurney loved to tell this story the rest of his life. Sure enough, he went over across the bridge, turned to the left, came down to Water Street, turned in, walked into the print shop, and said to the printer, who did not know him because he was not a writer, so he didn't have stuff printed, said to the printer, I understand that my friend Joseph Bates owes you some money. How much money does he owe you? $100. Interesting, that's just what he had been paid. So Gurney said, I'll tell you what, if you'll never tell Bates who paid the bill, I'll pay it off. Now again, this next part is not part of the story, but here's what I think is going through through Benjamin Lindsay's mind. You know what? If I just will agree to keep my mouth shut, I can get my money today. But if I won't agree to keep my mouth shut, I don't know how many more months before the Bates gets this thing paid off. Sounds like a good deal to me. I'll keep my mouth shut. Now that's not part of the story, but he does agree that he will not say a word. So pretty soon, a few days later, however soon it was, here comes Bates in. He's got a little bit more money. He's ready to pay a little bit more on the Sabbath tract. And Mr. Benjamin Lindsay's going to keep his part of the bargain. He says, it's all been paid. Now fortunately, it was very easy for Benjamin Lindsay to be able to do that because Bates lived by faith. His motto was, the Lord will provide. Apparently, Bates did not even bother to ask who paid. As far as he was concerned, the Lord had provided, that was good enough, and out the door he went. And according to Gurney, to Bates's dying day, he never found out that it was his friend Heman Gurney that had paid off the last $100 on the first Sabbath tract. Well, there's another story that's interesting dealing with Bates and the Sabbath. Now, that particular Sabbath tract that I just was mentioning came out August of 1846. Some way he gave, I don't know where, but he got a copy of it to some newlyweds who were married on August 30, 1846, James and Ellen White. James and Ellen White read the tract written by Bates. And they looked up the text, and they decided that the seventh day was the Sabbath. So they began to accept the Sabbath. Up to this time, they had known Bates, but they thought there were 10 commandments, and he was kind of a little overboard on number 4. But after they read the tract and realized that that's what the Bible teaches, they were with him in the Sabbath. Now, Bates does more study, he begins to study Revelation, he begins to see the fourth commandment in light of the third angel's message and the prophetic and theological significance, and he decides he wants to write a larger edition. He wants to add more material, more reason for why we should keep the Sabbath, the seal of God and this kind of thing. And here's another interesting story that you've probably heard, but if not, it's a good story about the Bateses. One day, while he's thinking about writing this new expanded tract, one day his wife Prudy comes to him and says, "You know, I'd like to do some baking. I need some flour." And her husband said, "Well, how much flour do you need?" "Oh, about 4 pounds. That will do. That will be fine." And so Bates says, "Okay." And he goes down to the general store there in Fairhaven, and he buys 4 pounds of flour, and he brings it home to his wife. She looks at him. Now remember, she's not a Sabbath keeper. We're talking 47 at this point, 1847. She looks at him, and she said, "What? You just brought me 4 pounds of flour?" And he said, "Well, isn't that what you said you needed? 4 pounds of flour?" "Well, yes, but," she said, "you know, you usually buy me a whole barrel of flour. Why'd you just bring me 4 pounds of flour?" Well, it was another one of these financial low points in Bates's life, and he said, "I spent the last money we have to buy that 4 pounds of flour." Now, she says, "What are we going to do? How are we going to live?" "Oh, the Lord will provide," Bates responded. Prudy says, "Yeah, that's what you always say. The Lord's going to provide, but how are we going to live? What are you going to do now?" I'm sure the woman, if I were interpreting the way the stories come to us, I'm sure that the wife was saying, "Are you going to get up and go get a job?" That's my interpretation of what are we going to do now? What are you going to do now? But anyway, he says, "I'm going to write a tract on the Sabbath." And the old story tells us that she headed for the bedroom for a cry. Joseph Bates is sitting there at his desk thinking about how he wants to get this tract started, how he's going to write it and all that. And he feels impressed that he should go to the post office and see if there's some mail for him. He felt impressed that there would be a letter with some money in it. So he walks down to probably the general store. That's usually where I think the postmaster was in those days. And he went in and asked if there was any mail for Joseph Bates. And you've been to historic sites. You know how they had those little cubby holes, you know, A, B, C, D. So I can see the postmaster pulling out the letters with the B's on them and looking down through the stack. Oh, yes, Joseph Bates. Now, back there in 1847, you could still send your mail 2 ways. You could either prepay it, or you just dropped it in the mailbox. And when the person got it on the other end, they had to decide whether or not they wanted it bad enough to pay the postage. Furthermore, it gets a little more dicey than that. You didn't write a return address on your letter. So I don't know how people decide they ever wanted to pay for their mail, frankly, unless you recognize that was my mother's handwriting or something, you know. I really don't. I don't understand it because they're all sealed up and there's just an address. Anyway, this one had 5 cents postage due. Well, it doesn't say postage due in those days. They just stamped a 5 or wrote a 5 on it. And if it was paid, they stamped paid or wrote paid on it. And that meant it was already prepaid. So here's 5 cents postage due. Bates, the postmaster, Mr. Drew, says to him, "Hey, take the letter, that's fine." Because Bates says, "I don't have 5 cents right now." "Oh, I've known you for years. Take the letter." No. I'm not going to owe anybody any money. But he says, "I feel impressed that there's money in that envelope." So he says to Mr. Drew, the postmaster, "You open the envelope and see." And sure enough, here was a $10 bill in the envelope. Somebody felt impressed to send it to Bates to help him with his ministry. So guess what? Bates now has $9.95 because he's paid the 5 cents postage due. Bates goes back to the general store. Now guess what he buys? A whole barrel of flour. And he buys some other provisions that he knows his wife wants, or needs, I should say, not wants necessarily, but needs. And he tells the drayman, That's the old-fashioned word for a delivery boy. He tells the drayman to take it to such and such a place. Man, I wish it had said in the story where that such and such a place was. Then we'd know where they live for sure, but it doesn't. It just says, take it to our house. And then Bates knows his wife. He says, now, the lady of the house, she's going to come out, and she's going to tell you that that stuff doesn't belong there, but you leave it anyway. I mean, he knew Prudy. So anyway, there he is. Now he's got that all set up, that scenario, and he decides he's going to walk across that bridge over to Mr. Benjamin Lindsay's print shop. And he walks in to see Mr. Lindsay, and he says, I want to write another pamphlet, and he arranged for printing, doing it on terms like he had before. Yep. He'd gotten paid before, so Benjamin Lindsay was agreeable to it. And he says, I need some ink, and I need some paper, and some pens, and all that kind of thing. And I think what Bates is really doing, well, he did need ink and paper and pens, but he's wanting that little scenario that he set up to have time to work itself out. Because you can picture him in your mind here, walking back across that bridge, turning left on Main Street, going up to where we think he lived, and slipping in the side door, and sitting down at his desk so his wife doesn't know that her husband's back yet. And pretty soon she walks by the door and she sees her husband sitting in there, and she gets all agitated. Oh, Joseph, guess what happened while you were away? Now, I know they didn't have Oscars or Emmys or anything back then, but he's going to put on an Oscar-winning performance. Well, what, my dear? What could have possibly happened while I was away? Well, the drayman came, and he brought this barrel of flour, and he brought all this other stuff, and I told him, we don't have any money. We can't pay for it. It doesn't belong here. Oh, Joseph, what are we going to do? Well, didn't I tell you, dear, that the Lord will provide? Well, yes, but... And he hands his wife the letter from this person saying, I feel impressed to send you this money to help you with your work. And the old story tells us that Prudy went away to her bedroom to have another cry, but a little different cry than the kind she had the first time. But that still wasn't enough for 2 more years, or 2.5, to get her to accept the seventh-day Sabbath. And while we're talking about the Sabbath, let's kind of work on down a little bit more about Bates. We won't say much more about him. Then I want to tell you one more story about the Sabbath, and that may about finish up our time. We'll see. But Joseph Bates stayed in Fairhaven until 1858. Every winter, as soon as the snow would come on, Bates would take off preaching. And he would go walking mile by mile by mile through the snow. Sometimes he could hitch a ride with somebody. But he was going and looking for isolated former Millerites. Because if he could find them, he did not have to share everything with them. They're already pretty well along. But he's going to have to share some things about, well, we do know what happened on October 22. We do know about the seventh-day Sabbath. So he's got some things, new light, he's got to share with them. But he's not going to have to share everything because they were already Millerites. And sometimes he'll write into the review and he will say that we just traveled. He's usually traveled with some young minister. He was, I guess you would call him sort of the one-man seminary back in those days, because he would take these young pastors, future pastors along, and teach them how to do evangelism, such as he did. His method of evangelism basically was to come into a home, talk to the people, tell them, why don't you send word around, we'll have a little preaching. They would set up the chairs in the house. He would preach for 2 or 3 days, hang up his chart, they would preach, and away he'd go. And walking through the snows. One time, as I say, he rode in, I think it was 20 miles. He had gone out of his way through the snow, walking the whole way to find an isolated believer, and then came back and moved on the direction he was going. He was an interesting fellow. In 1858, James White was trying to get all these Eastern ministers to move to the West, which was, of course, back in Michigan and those things, in those days. Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin, but move west. The country's moving west in the 1850s. And so Bates finally agreed he would come to Michigan. But would he think about settling down where there were a bunch of other Sabbath keepers? Well, there's no evangelism to do there. Why would he want to do that? I mean, by the way, in Battle Creek, there were probably 150 or 200 Sabbath keepers by then. That's way too many. He can't be in the middle of all that, so he goes to Monterey. And that's where he builds his house. It's still standing. The church doesn't own it, but that's where he lived the rest of his life. Prudy died in 1870. Joseph died in early 1872. Not too long before his death, there was a rumor going around in the Adventist church Isn't that amazing? Rumors in Adventist church? I mean, that doesn't happen anymore, but it did back then. Well, I wish it didn't happen. You know what? If we could get the gospel started as a rumor in the Adventist church, it would go around the world in about 2 or 3 days. The work would be done and Jesus could come. But anyway, so a rumor was going around in the church. And here was this rumor. The rumor was that he had recently been at a potluck and refused to offer the blessing when he was asked to offer the blessing. And it got so bad, the rumor was so widespread that apparently Bates thought he needed to write to James and Ellen White and describe what was happening. So he said, well, it is true that he had recently been at a potluck. And as he stood up to give the blessing, look out over the stuff there on the table, he noticed some things. He didn't say what, but that were forbidden by the Lord. So in other words, had pork in them. Now, not all the saints in late 1860s, early 1870s had yet sorted out the clean and unclean meat thing. As with other doctrines and teachings and beliefs of this church, light came and was studied out. And so Bates, it was clear, but there were some other of the saints that weren't quite so clear. So Joseph Bates said to Ellen White and James White that when he was asked to offer the blessing, he said, I offered it, and I asked the Lord to bless the healthy, wholesome, lawful food. He said, I left the unlawful unblessed. He said some noticed and some didn't, but his independence never left him his entire life. Oh, just one other thing. You know, this guy, he was amazing. There's a story about him on one occasion. He didn't have any money, but he felt like he needed to go do some evangelism. And so he felt impressed he should go on the train and do some to this place to do some evangelism. But he didn't have a dime in his pocket, but he got on board the train, sat down. He had not a clue what he was going to do when the conductor came around and wanted his ticket. But there he's sitting there. Somebody walked up to him and said, are you Joseph Bates? Yes. I feel impressed to give this to you. And he gave him $5, which paid his ticket. I mean, that's the way he lived. I was going to read something else here, but I don't see it. Anyway, I was going to tell you one other story before I close here. Oh, one other story about the Sabbath. And this is a good story for young people. In another place in Maine, not Gorham or Portland, Maine, where Ellen was, but in a little place called Paris Hill, Maine. It's very interesting, some of these European. Paris Hill's very close to Norway, Maine. So you can do quite international without even leaving the United States. You just go to Maine. Anyway, in a place called Paris Hill, Maine, there's a Paris, Maine, and a West Bay, South Paris, and a bunch of other Parises. But anyway, I think up in New England, if they got a good name they liked, then they just had all these others around, north, south, east, west, Poland Center, or Paris, you know. Anyway, so this is Paris Hill, Maine. That article that I mentioned, written by T.M. Preble about the Seventh-day Sabbath, that Bates read, Hope of Israel magazine, it was later almost exactly reprinted as a little 12-page pamphlet. A copy of that pamphlet made its way some way there into the central part of Maine, to Paris Hill, to a group of former Millerites. There's a young girl there, Marion Stoll. She's about 14 or 15 years of age. The parents, the Stoll parents, read the pamphlet by Preble, and they were not as impressed as Bates was when he read the article by Preble, because they didn't see anything in the Seventh-day Sabbath. And so the pamphlet was just kind of got tossed there somewhere in the house. But young Marion, somewhere a few days later, she sees it and she picks it up and she reads it and gets her Bible and compares. We've been keeping the wrong day. What's this young 14, 15, I guess she was 15-year-old girl. No, she was 14, I think. 14-year-old girl. What's she to do? Well, she had a brother that was a couple years older named Oswald Stoll. So she gets a hold of her brother and she says, would you read this and tell me what you think? And Oswald did. He read it, looked up the text. He decided they were keeping the wrong day. Now the parents have already said nothing doing, this is not for us. Here's these two teenagers. So they decide the next Sabbath they're going to keep the Sabbath. They didn't know exactly how, but they figured, well, I guess you keep it like you keep Sunday. So you do as little work as possible. So they try to keep Sabbath, just the two of them. Then Marion begins to have second thoughts. What if we're wrong? We better get somebody else that knows his Bible to check this out. And so guess who they asked? A young man that lived also there in Paris Hill, Maine, John Andrews. You know Jane Andrews because later he's going to become our first official SDA missionary. He's 15. Jane Andrews. 15 or 16, depending on when his birthday was. Why would Marion Stoll say that if anybody would know his Bible, it would be John Andrews, a teenager? Don't undercut, don't underestimate, don't denigrate our teenagers. John Andrews was a young man, a teenager, and he, of course, was a Millerite, had been a Millerite. He asked his father to get him some books. Now, what kind of books do you think a bright, young, committed teenager might be interested in? Well, he wanted some books that would help teach him how to read the Bible in Greek and Hebrew and Latin. He would get up early in the morning before his chores, an hour or so earlier before that, so he could read and study his Bible. Marion knew that if there was anybody in that community that could read that pamphlet and tell him whether or not the author was correct, it was John Andrews. So she gives it to 16-year-old John Andrews. He reads it. And he comes back to her and he says, that's right. We've been wrong which day we're keeping. The Sabbath is correct. What are we going to do about it? She said, well, Oswald and I kept it last Sabbath. Now what are you going to do about it? And he agreed he would keep it with her, with the two of them. So they're now, the next Sabbath, 3 teenagers in Paris Hill, Maine. And what do they decide they need to do at this point? Well, there's some adults that need to have some help. And so they began talking to the Stolls and the Andrews, the Andrews family and the Stevens family. Do you realize out of that little group in Paris Hill, Maine, would come the wife, not just Jane Andrews and not just Oswald Stoll and Marion Stoll, but the wives of Jane Andrews and Uriah Smith also came out of that little group there that those teenagers impacted, to show you how the Sabbath began to go. Well, you know, like some of you may have been there the first morning or second morning, I guess, when I did the morning devotional, and they got down to noon, and somebody said, well, it's lunchtime, and Ellen White had been preaching for 4 hours, and she said, well, I barely got to this point. Well, that's about the way I feel about Adventist history. We just barely got to this point, but the time says it's up. So we'll have a prayer. If any of you want to have any questions or whatever afterwards, that's fine, but we'll close this formally with a prayer. But to me, Adventist history is exciting. I think it's something that I wish our young people and some of our other members would get a little more interested in. I was going to repeat again what I said yesterday. My mother, or was it the day before? My mother's not sure how she hatched somebody that likes history so much, but I do think the story of God's leading in our church is an exciting story. And I'm excited by the fact that He's calling me and giving me the privilege to help finish the work that those young people and others started so long ago. And if only we had the same kind of commitment and willing to sacrifice and vision and focus on helping people get ready to meet Jesus, I think instead of your conference doubling its membership in the last 10 years, you would be exploding in membership, and so would the rest of our division. If we could get that kind of enthusiasm and commitment and be willing to sacrifice like our pioneers. But let's pray. Our Father in heaven, again, we spent a little time this afternoon thinking about the men and women that allowed you to use them to start our church. And Lord, I again pray that you'll give us the spirit of sacrifice and commitment, the willingness to share the news that Jesus is about to come. Help us to find ways to reach out to others so that Jesus can return. Be with each of us towards that end, I pray in Christ's name. Amen.